This is super fun for me to do. I could just probably sit and talk to Jay for a couple hours here, and I won't do that. I'm going to ask him a question, maybe one question, and then Mike Figueroa will have a mic that he can kind of pass around, and you guys can share your questions. You talked about this a little bit this morning, but the difference between violence in the holy books, well, I shouldn't say that even, in the Old Testament of our Bible and of the Quran, how that differs, how you said, this was in the first service, that the Quran kind of goes the opposite way. I'd be curious to hear you talk more about that, and towards how us as Christians, how do we make sense and how do we configure the purpose of all the violence that is in the Old Testament? Do we just like throw it away, say not anymore? Is there a positive use for any of that at this point? How does it compare to the Quran?
Yeah, that's actually a question we get hit with quite a bit, Ryan. We get a lot of Muslims ask, why, if your Old Testament is full of violence, here you have Joshua chapter 6, verse 20, 21, it says, God telling the Israelites to go into Jericho, kill all men, women, children, all living things. There's no verse like that in the Quran at all. So it looks like the Old Testament is much more violent. Yet you are, brethren in Christ, you're pacifists. And you say that God is a God of peace, but not the God of the Old Testament. He's certainly not a God of peace. He's more violent than anything we've ever seen. And that's the first question. The second that goes on from that is, what happened between the Old and the New Testament? Why did God, who is violent here, is no longer violent here? They accept that God's not violent in the New Testament. At least you got that part out of the way. And you can really underline that. We need to make sure that we specify that we are over on this side. We're on the side of the New Testament. We are a peace church. I don't know if you know that, but we're recognized by the government as a peace church. It's one of the 5 ones here in the United States that's recognized. So what do we do with the God here and the God here? It looks like a contradictory God, or a God that changes his mind, or maybe 2 completely different gods. Those 3 all come up, and you're going to get hit with this. Those of you who are brethren in Christ and want to stand for the peace of the New Testament. And this is what I do. I say very clearly, we need to not separate, we need to look and realize that God in the Old Testament is doing something totally different than what he was doing in the New Testament. It's not 2 different gods. It's not that God's changed his mind. No, God was doing something specific in the Old Testament. He was creating a nation for himself. He was creating a people through which the Messiah would come. Now, remember, those people that he had chosen them for when the Messiah would come, but they had just been 400 years in captivity in Egypt, and they had forgotten who God was, which means they had an enormous amount of evil influences all around them. More than that, they also as they were being sent down into Egypt, they were attacked by the Amalekites, and they were attacked by these the Canaanites. And God said that he would bring retribution on that because they were attacked. And when they came up out of Egypt, they were attacked again. And God said he would cause retribution. He would bring about eradication of those people because of what they had done to his people. So you need to put both those together. So now he comes with Moses, 1400 BC. Remember, this is 1400 BC. We leave it in 1400 BC. And when he says in 1400 BC, to kill all men, women, and children, why do you do that? Well, if you're going to create a nation of your own for which the Messiah is going to come, you want to make sure that you protect that nation, that you don't have any evil influences around it. Now, I told you this when we talked about this earlier. I use myself as an example because a lot of people say, well, how does that work? That doesn't make sense. I have 3 sons. And my oldest son at one time was 12 years old, and my second son was 6 years old, and my youngest son who's sitting over there was 6 years old. So 6, 12, 16. 16, 12, 6, 12, 6. That's more like it. So I got that. I'm terrible with mathematics, but I think that was right. Am I right, Judy? Was it 6, 12, 16 at one point? Now, let's go 6, 12, 16. I like it. It sounds easy. Now, my 6-year-old is like the Israelites in 1400 BC, back over here. See, my 6-year-old, when we were living in London, I would let him go outside the door because he would be hit by a bus, be killed. As a good father, protective father, I had all kinds of rules and regulations for him. And he could not go outside without being accompanied. He could not just run out in the streets. I had to take care of him 24 hours a day. That's just like the church, the Israelites who had come out of Egypt. They needed protection. They didn't even know who their God was. God had just done 10 plagues in front of their eyes. And they still didn't know who he was, because when Moses went up to Mount Sinai, they built a golden calf. Look how naive they were. Look how immature they were. They did not even know the God that they were worshiping. That God needed to protect them. That's why he eradicated everything, all the evil influences from around them. That's like my 6-year-old. But I have a 12-year-old. Now, my 12-year-old, I let him go all over London by himself. He could take buses anywhere he wanted. I had a whole new set of rules and regulations for my 12-year-old. And that's like God 2,000 years ago when he sent his Messiah. When the Messiah came, then everything that God had promised would happen was fulfilled in the Messiah. And that's why they look at the rules and regulations that you see. There's not many rules. There's a lot more. There's an awful lot of what's the word I'm looking for? But Paul, in almost all of Paul's letters, you look at their principles that Paul used. Not very many rules, nothing like the Mosaic Law. And the principles were much more freeing, but also took an awful lot more responsibility. I gave 2 examples in church this morning. One is, you heard it say in the Mosaic Law, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but now I say, turn the other cheek. That's a whole nother law, a whole nother paradigm, and it's a lot more difficult, is it not, to turn the other cheek when you're being abused and when you're being persecuted. You want to just have revenge. That's what he allowed them at the time of 1400 BC, but he did not allow them in the 1st century AD. And that's like my 12-year-old. It's a lot more freedom he has, but an awful lot more responsibility comes with that freedom. Now, who has changed between my 2 sons? Am I the same father for both sons? No. Yes, I am. I'm the same father for my 6-year-old as I am for my 12-year-old. Have I changed? Not at all. It's my sons who have changed. It's the children of Israel that have changed between 1400 BC and the 1st century AD. And they'd had 1400 years of prophet after prophet being sent to them, training them, teaching them, and bringing them back to understand the God who loves and always welcomes them home. But now, hold on a minute. I've got another son, 16 years old. Here, another prophet supposedly comes named Muhammad, 600 years later, in Arabia. And he comes with a whole new set of laws called Sharia law. Remember that? The other word is called fiqh, a whole new set of laws. Take a look at Sharia law and look at what we have, the principles that Paul teaches us, and you can see they're nothing alike. In fact, Sharia Islamic law is very much like Mosaic law. If you look at Mosaic law, it is almost exactly like Sharia law. Hold on a minute. Has God changed again? Has God regressed? And I say to my Muslim friends, now your prophet Muhammad came with a whole other set of law 600 years later, which is just as regressive as Mosaic law in 1400 BC. Now, I have a 16-year-old son. What would I do as a father if I started treating him like a 6-year-old? Would I treat my 16-year-old and have the same laws as my 6-year-old? There was no need in the world to treat him like a 6-year-old. In fact, I let my 16-year-old travel all over the world by himself. And as a good father, I was actually treating my sons with the maturity that I had trained them to be. And that's what God does with us. God does not regress, he progresses. So we're on the other side of history. We're now 2,000 years later. We have all of what Christ has done in his example, but he has given us something else even better than that. He has given us the Paracletus, the Holy Spirit, to teach us and to train us. So we are now 2,000 years later. We should be even more mature than the 1st century church. That means with that maturity comes also more responsibility. Does that make sense? And can you see that the violence was there to protect them? Yes, but we're no longer to use violence anymore. Now, I'm going to put one more spanner in the work. This is the question that I should have thrown at you. What about the other end, the other side of time, at the end times? Isn't violence coming back again? What is the church supposed to do about the violence at the last judgment? Armageddon. Muslims will hang you on this. They say, hold on a minute. So God uses violence back here in 1400 BC. He tells you no longer to use violence, so now you're a church of peace. But at the end of times, you're going to use violence again. How can that be right? Take a look and see in Revelation who is going to participate in that violence. We do not participate in that. The church is not involved in that. That is God and his hosts that come down and do that violence. God is a God of violence. Folks, we have to be careful about that. Be careful of what you call God. God does use violence. He has the right to do so, but we as the church do not. We cannot. We must not participate in violence. That's why the kingdom of God is the kingdom of peace.
Yeah, there's great realization that, we are called to be pacifists. God is not a pacifist, and we have to be clear on that. And people like John Howard Yoder and others would say that the fact that God has the prerogative to carry out violence in the end times, and etc., our pacifism is built on the fact that we can rely on God to be just. We can rely on God to superintend history to some degree and to be in the end just. We can trust that to God. That's His realm. We are called to something different. We are called to peaceful witness to His power. And what Jay's talking about is, which was in your little handout as well, progressive revelation. So would that be fair to characterize? That would be the word if you wanted to Google what exactly he's talking about. Progressive revelation. The idea that God, when God speaks to us, He speaks to us with a consideration for who we are and where we're standing in history and in time. That's who God is, right? So God's ultimate revelation is Jesus Christ, the person Himself. God tried to incarnate the truth as much as possible to be as readily available as possible to us that it's a human being we can interact with. But you guys didn't come here to hear me talk, so I'm going to stop preaching.
But to take that one step, we need to call it progressive revelation. Islam is regressive revelation. They go backwards.
Yeah.
We go forward.
Yeah. You always want to be progressive, not regressive. Mike has a mic. If any of you have a question that's coming to mind right now, you want to raise your hand and he can come hand that to you. Matt Franchina has a question. All right, here you go, Matt.
So as Christians, we've gone through kind of, if you watch the Discovery Channel, there's always the new Jesus or the real Jesus. There's always, so we're used to critical historical critiques on Christianity. And I just saw recently, I was actually watching some of your videos, and I went back and I watched Tom Holland's film on Islam, and I started reading some of Patricia Cronin's stuff about history of Islam, and it's quite fascinating. So now that universities and scholars are starting to critically break down Islam historically, how is the Muslim community taking this?
Wow, you got about an hour. What's your name?
Oh, Matt.
Tom. You read Tom Holland?
No, I watched his video. I read his book on the Forge of Christendom, I read The Forge of Christendom, which was good, and now I need to read the one about
In the Shadow of the Sword.
Yeah,
Read
that's
that
the next one. Yeah.
I was responsible for that. I don't know if you know that, but I don't say it publicly except here, because he does not like it when I let the world know that. And you read Patricia Cronin?
No, I was reading some of the stuff that she had put out back in the late 70s.
Okay, let me just bring all you up to speed what he's talking about. He's way ahead of the rest of you. There are very few people that have done what he has done. God bless you for doing that. If you want to see what.
Inflate his ego like that.
Oh, okay. I won't deflate it. I'll deflate it now because he hasn't gone far enough. But if you want to see what he's talking about, just go up on Fander Films. It's on the back of the card. That's our YouTube channel. We are now putting this very material that he's talking about on Fander Films as we speak. They've just been put up in the last 2 months. And tomorrow I'll be putting up a new film. We've just put a series of 6 films that go right through not only Tom Holland's material and Patricia Cronin's material, but also we're going through Dan Gibson's material, and we're going through a lot of the material that's coming out of the German school. So this is all being put up as we speak, and we're getting huge kickback from the Muslims. Because what he's asking is a very important question. When you look at the history of Christianity, we pretty well know who Jesus is, do we not? We know where he was born. We know where he grew up. And most specifically, we know where he died and where he rose again. The only controversy with that whole problem with Jesus Christ is his resurrection. No one today, except for Muslims, no one today would suggest that Jesus did not die on the cross in Jerusalem, right? Only Muslims say he did not rise, that he did not die. But they have a real problem because their testimony for that is from one verse, written 600, I would say 700 to 800 years after the fact. Now, with that knowledge, that much about who Jesus is, since he's such a historical figure, and since the questions that are being asked of Jesus since the time of the 1800s when this came up in the Tübingen School in Germany, in Wellhausen, saying, can we really know who this Jesus is? Can we know who Abraham is? Can we know who Moses is? Are these historical parents? Did they even exist? That has all been answered in the last 100 years. We have so much data on Abraham now. We have the Nuzi tablets, the Mari tablets, we have the Ebla tablets. We're putting together a tour of the Museum of the Bible. If any of you want it, we're going to take people, starting with the Brethren in Christ, take them on tours, just showing you all the artifacts they have just here in Washington. Much of it replicated from what's in British Museum, so that you can see just how accurate our Bible is historically. We have the right men doing the right thing at the right time in the right place. In every category, we can pretty well say that there's not one artifact that controverts a properly understood biblical statement. That's why our Bible is so good. But that's why we're so much further ahead of the Muslims and everybody else. Taking those same questions, who is Muhammad? Where did he live? Did he even exist in a place called Mecca? Was there even a city called Mecca? Now that seems pretty easy. Yeah, of course there's a city called Mecca. We know where it is. We know where it is today, but did you know there's no reference to that city at all in any ancient analogs, in any ancient writing, until 741 AD. 741 AD. Muhammad died in 632. Does that cause a problem? This is where he was born. This is where he grew up, supposedly. Yet it's on no map, there's no reference to it, there's no trade route that goes through it, there's no one reference for 100 years till 100 years after he died, which suggests that Muhammad did not come from a city called Mecca. There is no Kaaba. That's that building that they all pray to, that square building. We can't find any Kaaba in Mecca until 727. More than that, we can't even find any mosque facing Mecca until 727. Muhammad died in 632. Does that not create a problem? And every mosque that we've been able to find, and we've gone to now 65 mosques, every mosque from the 7th up into the 8th century are facing Petra, not Mecca. Petra is in Jordan, 600 miles further north. Can you see why we're even asking this question? What does this now do to this man named Muhammad? And then we're getting into the material that we're just putting up this week. Wait, and the most damaging material is about this book here, the Quran. Because if there is no Muhammad and if there is no Mecca, then what are you going to do with this book? Because this book refers to this man named Muhammad. Oh, hold on. Did I say it refers to Muhammad? No, it doesn't. You will find Muhammad's name only 4 times in this book. You will find Isa, Jesus' name, 93 times. Can you see there's a problem? Oh, it refers to the prophet of God, Abdullah. It refers to the Nabi Allah all over. It says over and over again, the prophet of God, the prophet of God. But it doesn't refer to him by name. And more than that, it doesn't refer to where he lives. Except once, in chapter 48, verse 24. Only one time does it even mention the city of Mecca, which suggests that there's a real problem within this book. Now we found out that we can't even find this book in the 7th century. There is not one manuscript that we can find, and we know of the 6 major manuscripts. In fact, I've got it on my computer at all. We now have all 6 major manuscripts, the earliest manuscripts. Not one of them is from the 7th century. Not one of them is complete. Not one of them agrees with each other, and not one of them agrees with this Quran that I have in my hand right here. This is the universal Quran. This is the Quran that every Muslim will tell you has never been changed, that was existed in heaven, has always existed, was sent down to a man named Muhammad between 610 and 622. This is the Quran that was then finally compiled at the time of Uthman in 652, and this is the Quran that has never changed in the last 1400 years. And we're saying all of that is a lie. But we couldn't say that more than 2 years ago. The reason is we finally now have all the earliest manuscripts. So when was this book put together? When was this book canonized? Does anybody know the answer? Do you know the answer to that? No. Do you know the answer? Yes, you do.
Like 1930s or something?
1924. 1924. Hold on a minute. Prince Philip is older than the Quran. Our darling old Prince Philip that is so senile, they don't like to him speak in public anymore. He is older than this book, which suggests that this is a very new, recent book, which means that this book was put together by men. It had nothing to do with God. It had nothing to do with Muhammad. It had nothing to do with Uthman. It was written by men in Egypt by a group of scholars commissioned by the King Fuad there in Egypt, so that all the Qurans in the Egyptian high schools could be standardized. That happened in 1924. It was finally made official in 1933, and then finally the Saudi Arabian government, realizing that they had so many Qurans, they wanted one Quran. They took that Quran, created in Egypt, and made it official in 1985, which means a lot of you in this room are older than the Quran. How does that make you feel? Now, why is it Muslims don't know this? Because no one has dared to say this in public. We're saying it. And can you see what we're doing? We're destroying not only Muhammad, we're destroying the Quran. And Islam is dependent on those two things. As we're dependent on the Bible and Jesus Christ, Islam is absolutely dependent on one book, one man. His name is Muhammad, and the book is the Quran. And ooh, it just makes my job so easy. Because everything I've said in the last 10 minutes has nothing to do with me being a Christian. Have you noticed? Everything I've said since you asked your question, anybody can say. And we need to say it. But we as Christians can say it much quicker and much better than anybody else because we've already had it done to our book. And that's why I love pitting these two books against each other and pitting the two men against each other. Whoa, it's so nice to be able to take Jesus to confront Muhammad and to take the Bible and confront the Quran. And what we're finding is that more people are coming to Jesus Christ because of that argument right there that you brought up. The argument, when they look at Jesus, when they look at Muhammad, they fall in love with Jesus. Well, why not? Of course you're going to fall in love with Jesus. There's nothing you can find wrong with Jesus. For 35 years, I've said, show me one thing wrong with Jesus. And I can't find anybody that finds something wrong with Jesus. Even Madonna loves Jesus. My Muslim friends all love Jesus. In fact, they come up to me all the time. We love Jesus. Why don't you love Muhammad? And I said, exactly. Of course you love Jesus. But I got about an hour, I can tell you about another 100 things I don't like about your Prophet Muhammad. Come on. Yeah, so this historical stuff is some of the easiest stuff for us to use. You understand it, even though you've not read all of it, but you can see how damaging this is. But then when we do that, all we do is we bring them home to this book. We just pass every one of those tests. Ooh, it's so nice.
Very good.
Yeah. Good question, yeah.
Jay, I have a question for you, a little bit more of a personal question. The culture, my take on the culture that I live in is one that even if what you're saying is true, and let me be very clear, I believe everything that you're saying is true. The way we say it in any kind of definitive statement in a culture like ours is seen so in such an aggressive light, right? And as Christians, though, I think we're called to live in truth regardless of the cultural temperature we live in. But I only ask you this because you have so much experience, I think, being the tip of the spear, pardon the analogy, to the pacifist that you are. But, really sort of being very, very aggressive with the truth in areas that are hostile. Do you have advice to Christians that live in a culture that's increasingly sensitive to that? Do you have some thoughts on that for us?
There's kind of two questions there, so let me talk to the first one. And that is, we've been asked to be loving and Christ-like in our response. That is a very European and very American approach. You're being very European by saying that. And I'm not really interested in Europe or America right now. I'm interested in Muslims who tend not to be Europeans and tend not to be Americans. If you're going to talk to a Muslim, you better be as forthright as they are. That's the problem right there. And we're not teaching our young men and women to do that. Because most men and women who go through our seminaries, they have classes on homiletics. And what are you taught in homiletics in seminary? 3 points, right? A sermon of 3 points, 20 minutes long. I know Terry doesn't like that, but 20 minutes long, 3 points with application for all 3 points. Am I correct?
And the points all have to start with the same letter.
And they have to be alliteration all the way through. You're correct, the same letter, so that people can memorize it. That's the way we teach here. But you go to a mosque on a Friday afternoon and watch a imam preach. And he starts soft. Then he gets louder, and then louder, and then louder, and then louder. And he really starts, and after a while, people start punching their fists, and they go, Allahu Akbar, Alhamdulillah, Bismillah, Ar-Rahman, and they start all in a language they can't even understand. Because 85% of Muslims don't even understand Arabic. But they all respond in Arabic, because that's God's holy language. What's fascinating is watch them. They have a totally different homiletical style than we do. Why is it when you go to a place like Britain, in the middle of London, you go down to a place called Speaker's Corner on a Sunday afternoon, almost everybody down there are Muslims. There are no Christians down there. Europeans don't like Speaker's Corner. They hate Speaker's Corner. It's the Muslims that love Speaker's Corner. And when I engage with Muslims, I have to be just like them. And I have to be just as aggressive as they are. But no, hold on a minute. Aggressive or passionate? I have to be as passionate as they are. And I have to stand directly for what I believe. And it has to be black and white. And I dare not say anything that I cannot support. Because I'm being filmed. Everything I say is being filmed. It immediately goes up the internet. And if they find any chink in my armor, I get laughed at, I got called at, I get mimicked, I get mocked, you name it. And after 25 years, I've had to memorize every one of my talks so that I never make a mistake. Now, I do make mistakes. Boy, do I have to pay the price. The interesting is, this is not taught in our seminaries. This kind of communication. We're not taught homiletics that way. We're taught to preach for 20 minutes for the crowd that actually agrees with what we're saying. They say amen. My crowd, if you look at Speaker's Corner, no one says amen. They're not there to say amen. They're there to try to shut me down. When we started at Speaker's Corner in 1992, that's when I started down there. When I started getting on the ladder in 1995, there were about 10 Muslim speakers on ladders. In Speaker's Corner, you get up on a ladder so your head's above the crowd. That's why these little kitchen ladders, not these big. You don't want big ladders because remember, you get thrown off ladders all the time. And the higher you are, the farther you have to fall. So you want just little kitchen ladders, 2 steps, so just your head's above the crowd, so you can have an authority and preach to the crowd. Now, there were about 10 speakers there with all their talibés, all their disciples around them, every ladder. And I was all alone when I started in 1992. There were no other Christians that were there in the afternoon. I was all alone. And I was not on the ladder, and I would have to get into the groups. I got punched, I got poached, I got pinched, you name it. And I would come home with bruises all over my midriff at the afternoons. It was only in 1995 that the police, I had got beaten up once really bad, and I was knocked unconscious by 60 Muslims who were kicking me. And a black man came and laid on top of me and took all my. I understand afterwards, I never met him. I never saw him. When I went to the Lord, thank him, he disappeared. But when that happened, they said you need to always be on a ladder. So I got up on the ladder from that time on. So from 1995 to 2017, I was always on the ladder for 22 years. Now, when you're on the ladder, you have a lot of authority. But what we noticed is that we could really start taking down the Muslim speakers just by using their material against them. And that's where we had to learn to read the Quran. We had to learn to go to the Hadith and the Tafsir and the Tahdi and the Sirah. Those were the 4 genre of this Islam. We had to learn the Islamic traditions. But they don't teach you that in seminary here. We had to do that by the seat of our pants, our team. And we learned only to use their traditions, only to use the Quran, and always to use their own material. Now if you go to Speaker's Corner, I can't say right today, but if you go to Speaker's Corner a year ago, there's not one Muslim speaker on the ladder left. We've taken out every Muslim speaker. Why? Because we went toe-to-toe with them. We didn't pull them down. We didn't physically do anything to them. We just confronted them so much so they could no longer speak, because the material we were using was their own material. Now, that's exactly what Paul did when he was there in the Areopagus, when he was there in the lecture hall Tyrannus for 2 years, it says there in Ephesus. He debated them. He went to the Stoics and the Epicureans, and he actually confronted them with their own traditions. Why aren't we doing that today? But to do that, you're going to have to be polemical, which is a word that we don't even use in the church anymore. You're going to have to be like Paul. He was as polemical as the Jews and the Gentiles that he met with. And he went into synagogue after synagogue in Berea, Cappadocia, Laodicea. Look at Acts chapter 17 to 19. Every synagogue he went and confronted the Jews. Why aren't we doing that today? Why aren't we going into the mosque and confronting the imams like Paul was doing? He got thrown out of the synagogues, he got thrown into prison, he got beat up, he got twice almost stoned to death, he caused a riot in Ephesus, and finally he was killed in Rome. Why are we following that model? That model does not exist today. We try to reproduce that model in London. We have a girl on our team called Hatun. If you go up on Fander Films and look at last year, she's on the ladder next to me. She's a Turkish convert from Islam. Her father was an imam, still is an imam in Turkey, well known. She goes to about 4 mosques every week, uninvited, walks right into the mosque as a woman, carrying the Qurans behind her, goes right up to the imam and confronts him with his own Quran. They throw her out, they throw her out, she comes back again. She comes back 3 times. By the 3rd time, they finally let her in. She has brought 125 Muslims to Jesus Christ in just 1 year. She has brought 5 Muslims to the Lord Jesus Christ. 5 imams. Imams, leaders of mosques. They've all had to leave their mosques and flee and go to other cities in Britain, all because of her ministry. She is a Sauline who's become a Pauline. I don't know if that works, does it? I'm trying to think of a feminine for Paul. Pauline?
Yeah.
Okay, so she is a Paul, a feminine Paul, a Saul who's become a Paul. We're looking for our Sauls, but to do that, we've got to go toe-to-toe with them. Now, that doesn't look good in Brethren in Christ circles, and it doesn't look good here in the United States, but I'm not asking you to do what I do. Please don't you do what I do. I'm a polemicist. You're to be nothing more than apologists. You need to defend Jesus Christ. Let me go on the offense, because I'm trained to do that, which means I've got to be just as passionate as they are. Not as aggressive, but passionate.
Thank you for sharing and answering our questions. I just had a question, and it kind of came up at the end there. So you mentioned in your sermon or talk earlier today that like Muslim faith is a family thing, whereas here we care about the family as well as Christians, but it's more of an individual choice in the U.S. especially. So I guess I was wondering what does it look like for a Muslim to step away from their faith, especially a woman like that woman that you were just talking about, and how can we help in that way, I guess, to be a support?
Brilliant question. Ooh, I like that one. That's your wife? How did you get someone that pretty?
Prayer.
He wants me to be kind to you. What am I not kind? What was your question again?
Sorry.
Okay, I did remember. The whole question of what we do, because the fact that they're in the oikos, and this is the thing, what do you do about family? And this is one of the hardest problems in Islamic work. That is, what do you do with these people who you know by virtue of the fact that they are going to leave, they are going to convert. When they convert, they're going to be thrown out of their family, they're going to be thrown out of their community. Many of them are going to be beat up, some of them are going to be killed. Hatun, they have tried to kill her 4 times. They almost succeeded about 2 years ago. They broke 3 ribs, they broke her leg, they almost broke her neck. They were actually stringing her up outside of a mosque early in the morning, and some Polish men saw what happened, and they came and protected her and saved her life. The 5 men that were trying to kill her are now in prison. What do you do with that? And the way I always do it is I say, listen, that's no different than the early church. The early church all went through that. You remember what I said this morning? The commissioning of the 12. Expect to be hated. Expect to be persecuted, to be jailed, to be flogged, yes, to be killed. Why have we forgotten those 5 things? If that is their commission, that should be our commission. But I go much beyond that. What do we mean by family? Well, Christ already answered that for us. When he was there teaching, and his disciples said, your mother's outside, she's waiting for you. He says, who's my mother? Who are my brothers? You are my mother. You are my brother. So he looked at the church. The church then takes over that responsibility. It is the church here, Encounter, that becomes the family for the Muslim. And that's what churches need to take on. We need to get back to that first century model. Anytime somebody was, and they were thrown out of their families, not so much like the Muslim family. The Muslim family is probably the hardest family. It's probably the most stringent family in the world because there are such a hierarchical system within the family. But more than that, when you leave the family, you leave everything. Unlike here in America. In America, you can pretty much leave the family and take on any faith you want. No one's going to kill you for it. They may get upset, but no one's going to persecute you or hurt you. But not so in a Muslim context. You will be killed if you leave. They're trying to kill Hatun right now. And almost every one of our converts, we have hundreds of them now. That's one of the hardest things, is to get them and to bring them into the church. Once they are in the church, their entire allegiance then becomes the church itself. But that's why Christ set up the church. Now can you see why the church is so important? Especially in a Muslim context. It's the church that takes on that responsibility to secure the convert, to take care of them financially, to take care of them emotionally, and then they become not only part of the church, but then that then has ramifications for the extended family. Now here's what we do what Judy and I, what we used to do in Senegal when we were in West Africa. We would ask our converts not to say immediately that they're a Christian. Don't say it. Be a secret believer for about 3 years. It depends on the person, sometimes maybe for a few months. Go back, continue to remain in the family, Continue to go even to the mosque, but pray to Jesus Christ when you're in the mosque. Don't ever tell them you're a Christian. But what then will happen is that you'll see that things happen. Because when people become Christians, they almost, right across the world, there is what they call redemption and lift. Have you heard this terminology? This is an anthropological term. That Christians, people all over the world, when they become Christians, they're redeemed, and suddenly they start lifting themselves. That means they become more honest. They don't lie. They stop swearing. They start having better relationships with other people. As they get to know Christ more, and as they read the Bible more, they become more Christ-like. And as you become more Christ-like, your relationship with your family improves, your relationship with your community improves, and that has ramifications right across the board. And this is the lift that they have found all over the world. And there have been many books written on this idea of redemption and lift. What happens, we have found in the African context, is that the family sees the difference. They see that Abdul no longer lies, that he actually gets to his job on time, that he no longer drinks, that actually he does eat pork now, but he doesn't have to eat pork, but nonetheless he becomes a lot more honest, and they start asking questions. What have you done? Why have you changed? When it comes to that, then they just say, well, actually the reason why is because I'm following Jesus now. And that brings the whole family through. We have found that the family are jealous for what Abdul is doing. They want the same thing. And what we find is, one of the fear in a Muslim context is if you become a Christian, you become a drunkard. If you become a Christian, you become a pork eater. If you become a Christian, then you become like the Catholics or whatever the churches in that local area, and that's despised. But you no longer are a Muslim. You're no longer a Senegalese. That you become a traitor to your own culture. So what we have said is stay in the culture, but at some point you're going to have to make that public statement. And when you make that public statement at that time, they're going to see that there's such an attraction to you that they'll probably want to come along with you. And you can get the whole family then come through. So there is a time when there needs to be a public separation from the oikos, your biological family. But there's no reason you can't bring them with you, because then we become that family. Does that help?
And this is we see the significance of this in our church a little bit when we have our baptism celebration Sunday, and very much, as someone in our bodies is baptized, they're declaring their faith to the church, and the church in turn is kind of there with them, assuming like some kind of responsibility and membership with this person, right? They're part of our family now. And so here you talk along these lines, how much more if, someone who in our community was Muslim who then was baptized in this, the amazing, immense responsibility we would have as a church family to support that person, maybe financially, in any number of really tangible, real ways. And so, yeah, that's a great question. Probably the best question we're going to get this afternoon. So thank you for asking.
No, these have been great questions so far.
This question isn't specifically to do with Islam. This is in reference to something that you had said during the second service, and I just wanted some clarification on. You had mentioned ordering God's love above God's sovereignty, and I know there wasn't a lot of time, it was kind of a passing point. So I was wondering if you could expand that a little bit, because I don't think that you were saying that God's sovereignty and His love are in conflict with each other, and I don't want us in the church to come away with that idea. Can you expand maybe a little on how God's love and sovereignty work together?
Could you also just clarify what you meant by sovereignty when you said that?
Yeah. When you look at the Calvinist or the Reformed position, you look at the Arminian, or you might say Wesleyan or Anabaptist position, because we belong to much larger churches than just the Brethren of Christ. You will see that on one side, the Calvinists always emphasize His sovereignty, and they do not want to see anything impugned about that sovereignty. And for them, sovereignty means that He is in charge. He is in charge of everything, even your salvation. That He chooses you, He elects you from before the time before time, you were foreordained to be saved. Ephesians 1. The problem with that is they've lifted God so high, and they've defined His sovereignty so resolute, that anything that impugns upon that threatens that sovereignty. And that's the difficulty. We don't sit there and start with that. We start with the fact that God is love. Yes, he is sovereign. But in that love, he allows us to either choose or reject him, which is not over on this side, and that doesn't take away from his sovereignty any more than if I have a child and I let my child, even though I'm sovereign over my son, I still let him choose whether or not he wants to criticize me or critique me or even reject me. And there's where the prodigal son story comes in. It's so handy because it shows that even our view of sovereignty allows even rejection of that sovereignty. That's the beauty. And why? Because of his love is outstanding. And so we emphasize that more so than the sovereignty issue. And that's why we come at God a different way. And that's why we love it when we hear that God is known as Abba, Daddy. Well, I want to model myself on that form of daddy. That daddy comes down and lets Jacob even win win at wrestling. And I used to wrestle with my sons, and I used to let them win. Just to make them feel good about themselves. Oh, I beat daddy today. Well, there's no way they could have beat me. I let them do that. Well, that's what daddies do. That sovereignty is not impugned by that. Still, God is still sovereign. God is still the creator of the earth. But he loves us so much we are imbued with his image. And his imageness, remember, within the imageness of the Godhead, of the triune Godhead, there has to be love, mercy, and sacrifice within the Godhead. And that's why I think it's beautiful that the triune God, that you have God the Father who's always loved God the Son, who's always loved God the Holy Spirit. If that is there within the Godhead, which is now explains why the Trinity is so important, because that means there is an object to my love. There's an object which cannot be if God is just one. That means there's also an object to God's sovereignty. And that object is us, or his creation. So all of that is wrapped up together, and it makes it so much easier when I'm talking to Muslims who have no idea of God being loving. That doesn't exist in Islam. That almost makes him inferior to believe, because loving requires an object. That requires another. And that requires a reciprocity, if it's true love. There has to be love both directions. In Islam, there's only love, not even love, it's fear and obedience and submission, and it's only one way. And that's from man to God, like a slave to a master. My God's my daddy, which means he loves me back, and he reciprocates that love. Oh, that's beautiful. So because we emphasize that from the Anabaptist tradition and from the Brethren in Christ, we don't have a problem with this whole debate on whether or not he allows us that free choice. It's assumed he allows us that free choice, because that is defining who God is. Still sovereign, still made the whole heavens and the earth, but allowed us, even though we knew that, we can still reject what he's done for us. Okay, does that help?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Okay, good question.
I'm going to follow up with something less eloquent.
And helpful, but and we've been talking about this a little bit in our growth group this summer. So Len and Linda Weaver, if you want to speak on this at all, you're welcome to. We believe that God is fully sovereign. We believe God is all powerful, all loving, all knowing, etc. But the question then is, how does he use that sovereignty? How does he play that out? And the scripture that we went to a lot was Philippians 2, 5 to 11. He did not consider equality with God a thing to be clung to. God has all power and authority and sovereignty in the world. And what does he do with that power? He made himself nothing, becoming in very nature a servant for our sake. And he is exalted. He comes to us that way. He is God in that way. That is who God is. He is God who's all powerful, and in being all powerful, approaches us as a servant, taking on that very nature. And that's the God we worship.
That reference there is one of the best references to use with Muslims, by the way, Philippians 2, 5 through 11, because Muslims think that we have elevated God to the status of divinity. We've elevated a prophet, a man, like all the other prophets, and we are guilty of elevating him and making him a God. When you look and just take Philippians 2 and just read it to them and unpack each verse by verse, no, it's the other way around. He took on himself. He chose to come down and take on, humbled himself. I love that word, humbled, you're right. And take on all our infirmities except one. He never sinned. He never sinned. That's the one infirmity he did not take on. Now that's something resonates with Muslims, because you can go back to chapter 19 of the Quran, verse 19. 19:19, that's an easy way to remember it. Because there you have Gabriel coming to Mary and said, I'm giving you a righteous son. He's the only one that's called righteous. Every other prophet sins except his son. There's a great bridge you can use, using the Quran itself, to show that something is unique about this son. He is the righteous one who comes, which means every infirmity, yes, he came as a child. That means he had to eat. And Muslims are aghast that God could eat. Yes, my God can eat. Well, who do you think was there at the tent, in front of the tent of Mamre, eating with Abraham? You claim that that's God. What was he doing? He was eating. So be careful, because you're going to have to confront your own Old Testament. But I love that, because then they say, well, you mean God can go to the toilet? I said, yes, my God can go to the toilet. Can't yours? Get a bigger God. It means I can do something your God can't do. And by that time, you can see the real implications of what they've been saying. But all of these things are brilliant, because you can just go back and do a back and forth between the two different gods. And it's so great to be able to do that with Muslims, because they don't know what to do with Philippians 2. It's such a good set of verses. And everything, the gospel is right there. Just those 6 verses. The entire gospel is right there. And it's so clear when Muslims realize that it's not that we've elevated him to God. He's come and taken on human form, the other direction.
Good question. Good. Got time for a couple more.
I have a question about, so back in Genesis, when they have the flood, do the Muslims have their own story of the flood? I don't know much about Muslim history, so I wouldn't know. So I was just wondering.
The Quran does not talk about the flood except in passing. And this is the problem with this book. It doesn't really have any complete stories but one. There's only one complete story in the entire Quran. There's the problem, difficulty, and that's why all the way through the Quran, in chapter 10, verse 94, in chapter 21, verse 7, it says, if you have any questions, go to the people of the book, come back to the Bible, go to the Christians, ask them, because we have the full story, including the flood. They don't know what the flood's about. They have no idea what happened there, and they have no idea the significance of who Noah was or anything he did. So the story is there, but it's only opaquely and it's only inferred. That's why I go to chapter 5, verse 46 and 47, verse 68, and we are to go back to our own scriptures. We are, Christians, are to go back to our Bible and use it as our authority. It's very clear in the Quran. We're not to go to the Quran. We're to go to our own Bible. Ooh, I love that. It's beautiful. Sends me right back home. So be careful with their stories. They're only half stories. They've got to come home to us to get the whole story. Who's that guy that was on radio all the time? And that's the other
The rest of the story.
That's the rest of the story.
Paul Harvey.
Paul Harvey always said, and that's the rest of the story. And that's this book right here.
That's what he's talking about.
You just answered my question. So,
Well, what was your question anyways?
I was going to talk about, in reference to the Quran, or coming to the Quran, to bridge the conversation back to Scripture, so to speak out of, if the Quran says this, well, let's dovetail this in, or let's use this as a bridge to Scripture. Then what do we make of the Quran as far as inspiration, or as far as evaluating truthfulness? Yeah.
I knew you'd get to it. That's good. That's the better question, the second part of it, which really is what we need to do with. What do we do with this book? Because if we're going to start using this book, are we not giving authority to it? Is that not dangerous? Are we then saying that we believe this book? And be very careful. Anytime you use the Quran, say, this is your authority, but this is not my authority. Say that. Make sure they hear that. Otherwise, they'll start saying, oh, so you do accept the Quran. No, we don't. Even when you use bridges, and there's lots of bridges you can use in this Quran. We do a whole training on just using bridges. And I have a whole lecture just on bridges and blockages. There's not time to do that. But every time I do that, I make sure that this is not my authority, but it's their authority. So I start with their authority, what they're familiar with and what they can believe. And then I bring them back home to my authority, which is the bigger the better book, and it has a lot better stories and much better stories. And they all fit to a piece. None of them contradict. And you can see the whole plan of God's salvation all the way through. Now, on saying that, there are some bridges that are not there that many Christians are using. Be careful. There's a whole new group called the Camel Method. Are you familiar with this? Be careful of the Camel Method, because they go way beyond what I will do. They are actually trying to find the gospel in the Quran. The Inside Movement is doing this. And I will not. This is not the gospel. You will not find the gospel here. And if you do find the gospel in the Quran, then you're doing what we call eisegesis, which means the opposite of exegesis. When we're in seminary, when we're teaching, we're told to exegete the scriptures. That means you go to what the author intended. You don't impose your own agenda on that scripture. And yet we're doing that with the Quran. I've heard many Christians say, chapter 4, verse 157, which says, they killed him not, they crucified him not, they thought it was so, another was given his image, which is against the crucifixion of Jesus. They say, well, we have to unpack it. What it really is saying is, the Jews did not kill him. It's true, the Jews did kill him, the Romans killed him. So that's not a denying the crucifixion, it's actually accepting the crucifixion. No, it's not. And any Christian that does that to the Quran is doing the same thing that what Muslims do to my Bible. When they go and they see Jesus bowing down with his head to the ground in the Garden of Gethsemane, he said, see, Jesus was praying like a Muslim. Jesus was a Muslim. No, that's called eisegesis. You're imposing on that, which is not what the author did not intend. So that's what I would be careful of by using the Quran. Don't use eisegesis. Make sure you exegete it correctly. It doesn't need, we don't need to find I don't want to find the gospel in there, because if that's the gospel, I'm scared. That's not my Jesus, that's not my God, and it's not my gospel. Okay? Hope that helps. Good question.
So I have a question in specifically relating to politics and religion, like you talked about earlier. And my specific question is how Muslims justify their actions throughout terrorism, domestic violence, and public humiliation and public violence. How did they justify that through the Quran? And how can we justify, or how do they justify that religiously, politically, and socially? And then how can we counteract that through as Christians?
Ooh, that's an easy one. Basically, I'll just say in one sentence. They go to this book. And everything you have just said is in this book. You name it, I'll find it for you. Cutting off the heads of the unbeliever. Chapter 47, verse 4. Cutting off the hands of the thieves. Chapter 5, verse 38. 100 lashes to the adulterers. Chapter 24, verse 2. Beating your wife. Chapter 4, verse 34. Slaying the unbelievers until there's no more unbelief in the land. Chapter 8, verse 39. You want me to go on? Everything that ISIS did, you will find in this book. Did you notice? Everything ISIS did, they always wrote about it afterwards. They always put it in their tabik, it was their journal. And they always quoted scripture to support whatever they did. So, how do they support it? How do they justify it? They just go to the Quran. This is one of the most violent books you can read. Now, why haven't you been told that? None of you have been told that, have you? You've been told that this is a book of peace, right? You've been told that Islam is a religion of peace, am I correct? You've been told that Muhammad is a man of peace, am I correct? That's what's taught in all your schools, that's what's taught in all your seminaries, in all your universities. In America and in Europe, that's all we're allowed to teach. Well, whose agenda is that? And why is it that no one is able to confront that? Because none of you have read the Quran. They don't teach you to read the Quran here in America. There's not one seminary that teaches you to read the Quran. And yet this is the largest and fastest religion in the world today. It's the religion that's no longer over there. It's very much in our neighborhoods. It's coming all around us. And we're not even told what is it that we're up against. Because if you want to know why ISIS did what it does, while Al-Qaeda does what it does, while Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab, they all follow this book. And if I was a Muslim, I would be just like them. Because I follow this book. This is why I always keep these two books. These are the only two things I take with me everywhere I go. These two books. You'll see them in all my videos. Because if you want to know what we're to do, we go back to this book, which says to put away the sword, which says to love your enemies, which says to turn the other cheek. This book gets it right. That's why we don't allow violence in the church. That's why we are a church of peace. We do have a man of peace. And our God is a God of peace, but he's also a God of violence, as we said on the other side of time. This God in this book and this man behind this book are full of violence. Now, I have asked this for 35 years. I've asked Muslims one simple question. If you really believe that you are a religion of peace, show me one verse that says you're to have peace with me. I've asked that for 35 years. There's not one Muslim that's been able to find one verse that says that they're to have peace with me. You will not find it in the Quran. They're not to have peace with us. It's very clear in the Quran that they are there to make war upon us. Now, Muslims in America, Muslims in Lancaster County will have not read the Quran. Okay, so the Muslims you meet won't be able to know this. They'll mimic everything they hear you say. They will claim for their God and for their religion. You will hear many Muslims here in Lancaster County who say, yes, we are a religion of peace. Muhammad was a man of peace. The Quran is a book of peace. And when you ask them to support that, well, they'll go to maybe chapter 2, verse 2, 5, 6. For there is no compulsion in religion. That's their favorite. Tell them to read the rest of the verse. For those who stand against Allah, great shall be their reward in hellfire. They'll tell me if there's no compulsion. Then they'll go to chapter 2, verse 190, which says, if they attack you, defend yourself, but don't go beyond the limits. That sounds pretty peaceful until you read the next verse. And slay them wherever ye find them. You just need to read the whole verse. And then Obama's favorite one was chapter 5, verse 32. O children of Israel, he who takes the blood of one, it's if he takes the blood of all. But he who saves the blood of one, it's if he saves the blood of all. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Don't slay, save. That's what we say, right? And that's what Obama and all your pundits say. See, that proves that this book is a book of peace. That has nothing to do with Muslims. It has nothing to do with me or you, because look at the front of the verse, the top of the verse. O children of Israel. That's how the verse begins. This is for the Jews. You need to read the next verse, verse 33. And to those who stand against Allah and his prophet, crucify them and cut off their hands and feet from opposite ends. That's what the Quran says they're to do with us. Now can you see why ISIS did this in Aleppo? Cutting off the heads of all those people and putting them on stakes and putting their hands and feet and crucifying them in the town squares. They were just following chapter 5, verse 33. So if you want to find out why Islam is doing what it's doing, it's this book. Now can you see why I'm attacking this book everywhere I go? Can you see why we need to destroy this book? Not Muslims. Love the Muslims, but confront Islam. I love the Muslim. That's our tagline on my with Fander Films. Love the Muslims, confront Islam. Because this is what I have to confront. I've got to confront the book that forces them to do what they're doing. If you were a Muslim, you would do the same thing if you really wanted to follow God. Knowing that, we've got to confront this book. Hope that helps. Yeah.
I hope I have a less violent question.
Was that a violent question?
It's exciting to hear the changes that you saw in the 90s with the imams coming down off the ladders. I'm curious, in more recent history, has things like the election of Mayor Khan changed the political climate or how your ministry is being affected on the ground in London?
Yeah, I wish I could give you a positive response to that. We're finding that Britain is slowly seeping into an Islamic morass. Not only is London now have a Muslim mayor, we have 12 cities that now have Muslim mayors in Britain. We have no-go areas now that we never had when I started. We have by far much more stronger radicalism in Britain than ever when we started 25 years ago. When they immediately after 9/11. So that was 2001. When they did a survey asked to find out which people supported, only 15% supported the radical movement, Al-Qaeda and those groups. When they did a survey in 2006, 5 years later, this group of 15% had grown to 43%. Almost half of all Muslims had now moved to the right. And the reason they moved to the right is because of this book. They're going back and reading it for the first time. And they're reading it in English so they can understand it. And if you are a Christian and you feel threatened, where do you go? You come back home to this book, do you not? I hope you do. You come back to the Bible. It stands to reason that the more Muslims feel threatened around the world, as they are because of the wars that are happening, the more they're going to come back to their authority, which is the Quran. And the more they're going to follow their model, who is Muhammad. And that's happening in Britain. It's sad to see, and that's why we hope America does not go the way of Europe. Europe has now invited millions of Muslims in. Merkel has invited 1.2 million Muslims into Germany in just 1 year. That's going to have huge ramifications. She doesn't know what she's up against because this is not a religion that separates church and state. Everything they do is their religion, as I said upstairs. Because of that, we're finding dislocation in Germany. And this is why, be careful who you invite. Muslims are the most difficult people because every area of life impinges how they walk, talk, eat, drink, sleep, what they wear, how long their beard is, all is a religious act. We don't do that as Christians. We can walk, talk, and eat, drink as we want. We can even drink and eat pork. They can't do any of that. That is now they're imposing all over Britain. All of our schools in London, all of our hospitals, all of our prisons only now serve halal meat. In my area of Harrow, where we lived, there is no more ham, and in the restaurants we can't eat ham anymore. The Muslims have even taken over our menus. Now, this is what happens. They don't really care to be liked or disliked. They are following God's precepts. And for them, those precepts involve every area of life. That's why we're up against a totally different kettle of fish when you're talking about Islam. It's not like any other religion. It's not like any other faith. Remember, they are the fastest growing religion in the world today, not by conversion, by biological growth. You were born a Muslim. In Britain, an average woman has 2.7 children? But an average Muslim woman has 4.2 children. So they have double the national average, almost double. Okay?
So you're kind of touching on what my question is rather than a religious aspect, they have such a strong cultural aspect. When I was in Iraq, a lot of what they did was cultural. Many of them hadn't read the Quran, but they'd still burn people at the stake, still cut off heads, just as a matter of fact, culture, getting honor back. So how, when you say love the Muslims, how do you completely destroy their culture? Because that's what we would need to do to actually make them not such evil beings.
Yeah, I would be careful about them. They're not really evil. I don't consider them to be evil in that respect. What they are doing is they're trying to follow their God as best they can. What has happened in places like Iraq and the Middle East is that they have 1,400 years of Islam permeating their culture, so that almost everything in their culture now has become Islamic, except because almost all the way they treat their neighbor, the way they treat their women, the way they treat their whole educational system is based on Quranic precepts. Even now, many of the schools in the Middle East now only teach Islamic law. They're teaching, they want the Islamic law to be brought in. There has been a movement against that called the Pan-Arabist movement started by Kemal Nasser. He wanted to stop that because he saw what it was doing to the culture. So it's difficult to know who's going to win out. I would suggest that it looks like the Islamic culture is where it is winning out. Look what's happening in Turkey with Erdogan. He's now bringing Islamic precepts into all the schools and the way he does his politics. The same way in Iraq, where you are. Now that's been taken over by the Shiites. They now control the culture. They're bringing in Islamic law. It looks like the same way may happen in Syria, which is rather odd because Assad is not a Sunni. He is a Shiite. He is a minority, and he is the only one that protected the Christians there because he saw the plight of the Christians. Those who are against them, the ones we're supporting, are all the renegades, and they're all Islamic, and they're all much like ISIS. So it's hard to know the future, what's going to happen there. The answer to that, of course, is the gospel. The only thing I can see that's going to stop this is the gospel. But that's been the answer for 2,000 years. There is every culture that Christianity has gone in has changed it. As much as you want to say that Europe is not Christian, it is not Christian, but it's still based on a Judeo-Christian memory. Our laws, our precepts, the way we treat families, the way we treat women, the whole view of love, the whole idea of the family structure is all based on the gospel. And one of the things I always remind my Muslim friends is when I look at the United Nations, UNHCR, United Nations Human Rights. What's that law? What's that called, that document? Declaration of Human Rights, UNDHR. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights is considered to be the most far-reaching and most universal laws of what is right and wrong in the world today, signed by 126 nations. Look at the 21 articles in the UNDHR, and you will find that every one of those 21 articles are biblical. They all come out of the New Testament. The idea that you have a choice of who you want to follow or what you want to follow, that comes straight out of the New Testament. The idea of democracy, the idea that everyone has the right to choose equally, that comes straight out of 1 Peter. And of course, Galatians 3:28. The whole idea that you can choose who you want to marry, or you can choose your faith and reject your faith. That is biblical to the core. This whole idea that almost every one of those articles, the fact that they're biblical, shows that we have had an awful lot of impact on the world today, on our culture, Western culture, though the West does not want to accept it. And I find fascinating when I talk to atheists, and I say, what's your view of family? And they say, well, one man, one wife, and a child. I said, no, that's not the view of the family in the first century. In the first century, when Christianity was begun, look at the relation. The strongest relationship in the first century was between a man and a man. Pederasty was how they did their educational system, and pederasty was all based on men taking young boys into their home to train them up, and they would sleep with the boys for payment. That the church stood against, and it was Christianity that eradicated pederasty. It was Christianity that eradicated homosexuality. It was Christianity that brought and introduced the whole educational system that we have used today, and finally allowed women to be educated. So all of this, I would say, is the gospel. We need to bring the gospel home. We need to be a lot more energetic about it. That doesn't mean that we make cultures Christian, or say nations Christians, but we do make cultures Christian. You see the difference we're making? We don't come and make them, we don't make Christian nations, we make people Christians. And we bring the kingdom into every area of life and redeem every area of life. There's my answer. Well, that's a boring answer, but it's the answer that's been around for 2,000 years. And I don't want to change it.
That's a good answer. Go, last one for Darcy.
So the many Muslims that get to hear you speak to them, do you have the blessing of hearing back from any Muslims that do convert to Christianity? Do you get to hear your hard work, coming around?
Well, that's a good one to end on. This is a great one to end on, Darcy. This is really what the question that a lot of people I do get in churches that don't hear. The problem with my ministry is almost all of it is online now. When I was at Speaker's Corner, we did get people who came through, but never ever at the corner. It was too dangerous. It was always away from the corner. That's where they came through. Or they would take us out to coffee. We do it, and then we would never ever show them off. We would never talk about them. That's why you can't. I'm not permitted to talk about the people that have come through. I can talk about a few. What happens though is because my ministry is so all over the world now, and my face is so public, we're getting almost over 1 million people have watched those videos, and we're finding hundreds are coming through.